Hey, people. All right, pull up the lecture. Do you guys have a good, whatever it was, break? Labor Day? Vacation? Sleeping time? No going outside because you'll wind up with like COPD in 10 minutes?
Yeah. Or I'll have an asthma attack. Could be either.
Pardon?
Or I'll have an asthma attack from all the smoke.
Yeah, I mean, I think the asthma, well, there's like pulmonologists are going to make a killing on this last month. The Oregon, where I'm from, is burning too.
I have a question.
No. Yes. What's the
Can you
question?
see me? Can you see my picture?
Oh, Gianna! Hey! Sorry, I wasn't looking at the screen at all. That's funny. What are you doing?
Oh, I'm hanging out at their house. All my friends live in the same house.
Okay, is this like at Nathaniel's place or something?
No, it's like Vivian lives here. That's why I have
Oh,
to
okay. Okay. How are you? I haven't seen you in now exactly no time, but I haven't seen you in a long time.
Yeah, I know. It's been okay. How have you been doing?
Mostly good.
I need,
Like,
I
good give or take.
I've been meaning to ask you to write me a letter of recommendation for grad school when I
Oh,
apply.
obviously, yeah. Just let me know. Just send me a link and let me know.
Yeah, I'm taking microbiome right now. That's about it.
Okay, good.
I
Okay,
just wanted
it's so nice to see you.
I know, it's good to see you too.
So I hope all is wonderful and whatever wonderful entails.
Life is life.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna go pull up it was so nice to see you. I gotta pull up the lecture and say some stuff class oriented. What is this, number 7?
You made us learn.
And okay, I assume people can more or less see and hear. Pull up the chat. Yeah, so it seems as always, if you have a question, type it or unmute and speak up or whatever, and I'll just keep plowing. I'm just going to keep sort of marching ahead, skipping lightly over the things I don't really care to talk about and spending more time on the things that are A, more interesting, or B, more likely to be heavier on an exam. So we're here, not that much more time before the exam later this month. So we're kind of getting dangerously close to that territory. 100-point exam, whatever. These are examples of the posters. So this semester, it's going to be a little bit different. It's all going to be online. Obviously, but there's no printed posters, none of that. But this is still essentially what you're going to make, but you'll choose whatever your topic, whatever you want it to be. The 2 posters I'll show you today were both accepted for publication and presentation at Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise is the journal, and ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, is the convention. But so this one was using exercise as rehab for drugs. Good poster. You can look at this and sort of structure your project based on this. And this is a great one that I want to publish, except the CEO of Sparta, who this is on Sparta Technology. I mean, he practically sent me death threats. You publish one more thing, I'll sue you stuff. Pardon? Was that a question, or was that like, internal commentary? I will assume.
No, sorry about that. I forgot my audio was. I forgot I was on mute.
So this one, this is. If you know Maggie Bristow, this was hers from, I think, 2 years ago. And not all science says what you were hoping to find, you find, right? So we were sort of hoping to see that Sparta technology had predictive elements and performance of basketball. We spend so much time and money and effort testing people on Sparta here at Pacific, and then we spend so much time and effort and maybe a little bit of money collecting data on all the subjects in terms of their performance on the court. What is their points and assists and everything per game, and the turnovers and whatever. And so do these load, explode, and drive that come from Sparta, do those variables predict performance of our basketball players, holding constant, some other potentially confounding variables, and we found that it just sort of doesn't matter, it doesn't help, and it's non-significant, but if anything it shows the opposite of what they're claiming. But we're really careful to put in all the data quality metrics to say, like, these analyses these are sound, what we did, that's what all this stuff is. Knowing that whenever you say something doesn't do what someone else says it does, when you come in and say the opposite of what industry says, you'll be a little bit attacked, and we were a lot attacked on these. It's a good poster, it's a sound poster though, and so this is something that you could. Here's a study been done at any other Sparta track schools. Some data on Sparta, some of it's promising, some of it's a little bit industry funded in sort of a suspicious way, but I'm not saying Sparta is bad. I'm just saying a lot of the claims and the claim, we couldn't find any positive claims for it in basketball, is all I was saying. But this semester, get in touch with Nathaniel, your GA, if you want to present or publish data. It just depends on the quality of it. ACSM is fun. Gianna has been 2 or 3 times now. This is from the first year. This is Haley. She's currently doing her MD at Davis. We published together a couple of times. I cannot go through an airport without being like searched by people. But it's an enjoyable experience. Just ask Gianna, her and Nathaniel and everyone else who's been multiple times. We have fun. This upcoming one is in Washington, D.C., and I assume it'll be actually ongoing, as it'll happen in real life as opposed to digital life. I think COVID will be sort of solved by then. So epidemiology, we'll just do a really fast recap today. Remember what falls upon the people. As opposed to endemics, we have epidemics. And so COVID is the epidemic everybody knows about now, but endemic and epidemic, right? This comes from Hippocrates. So if you think about endogenous and exogenous, just go biology, endogenous versus exogenous, internal versus external. And epidemic is arrives, it's COVID, it comes. Endemic is something that's within a population. Some sort of population is especially susceptible to something. Malaria isn't really an epidemic. It's more endemic to particular regions, environmental regions. Malaria or Wuchereria, or most of these areas. Would be for which you would take like Mectizan or these sorts of diseases and illnesses related to that drug class are more endemics. Epidemics are things that come and visit and spread and whatever flus. Just remember political arithmetic, John Grant, first name to remember, John Grant, political arithmetic. And then where we left off last time was John Snow. And we talked about all these papers. So this is sort of what we went through at the end of last lecture, where we have this obstetrician who decides to start exploring cholera and what causes cholera. And so 1849, right, he publishes his first paper. And that first paper was really on intercourse, right? It's cholera and whatever other STDs. I mean, that was the perspective of what cholera was at the time. And then you get into like the second, third paper. These ones he's making a little bit more room for alternative explanations, drinking contaminated water, stuff like that. Third and fourth, more summary statistics, some data on you don't need to know these things, these specific things you don't need to know. This is a jumping off point for where we're headed next. But this guy just publishes and publishes and publishes on cholera. And third and fourth papers looking at descriptions of infected communities. I mean, this is how research starts. You sort of have hunches and you're testing them. By the fifth paper on, he's talking about contaminations of water, right? There's feces in the water and we're drinking it. And that it seems to be what we're ingesting that's causing the problem. And should we be taking notes about Jon Snow? Yeah, do take some notes about Jon Snow, because this is the second name. This is the second name that's really important. And so definitely take notes on this part. So remember, I mean, this is like, when you look at his the ninth paper, not his last, I mean, there's tons of papers, but August 12th, 1854, his ninth paper on cholera comes out on August 12th. Now, August 31st, 1854, so half a month later, the massive cholera outbreak that's in every single epidemiology textbook, most research methods textbooks, some statistics textbook. I mean, this is the foundation of epidemiology happens here, half a month after his ninth publication on cholera, where he'd sort of figured out what's causing it. And so this is Soho. You see Soho here, but it's this sort of district of section of Westminster. And so it's the West End of London is where we are, and this is worse than COVID, right? This is much worse than coronavirus, because within it starts on August 31st. By September 10th, less than 2 weeks, there are 127 dead, right? There are 127 people dead right in a little section. It's like saying on campus at Pacific, 127 people dead. So this isn't some national number or like California number or whatever. I mean, this is like around a water pump. There's 127 people who just died. And during the first 3 days, and then within the first 2 weeks, there's 500 deaths, and eventually there's over 600. And it's hard to count back then, because I think people's lives weren't really tracked all that effectively. But so you see the River Thames runs through here, spelled like Thames, the River Thames. And the important parts on here, you see Lambeth down here, Southwark right here, and Westminster, right? Soho's in there. And so these three regions, this Westminster's, Lambeth, and Southwark. So where people are getting sick is over here, but the water supply from here, from these two places, comes in and becomes the foundation of epidemiology. So, you know, if your house is more than a couple hundred years old, I'd check your floorboards, underneath the floorboards. People used to just dump their shit in these cesspools under their floorboards, and it starts to stink, right? And people, this idea of miasma or miasma, this concept that all disease is communicated by scent, right? Sort of the soul of a disease enters your nostrils and then sort of penetrates your insides from there. And so the insides of people's houses reek, right? They just really start to smell because people are storing their shit in the floorboards. You know, remember, like, toilet paper was 1857, Joseph Gaiety. And so when we're in this age, we are not hygienic. Our like butthole sanitation is not a thing. And so eventually it's like smelling in the houses. And so people just start dumping all of their shit into the River Thames, right? The river that's running through, like, oh, it'll carry it away. It'll go away forever. This is just, you know, the current of the river will redistribute our potential miasmic vectors. And so again, at the time, people thought this is Robert Seymour, you know, Charles Dickens, the author who did like Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist and A Tale of Two Cities and like all those sort of famous stories. This was his artist who actually had this wasn't his artist. This is one of the pieces of art of his artist, Robert Seymour, who ended up, I guess, killing himself over a dispute with Charles Dickens. But don't write that down. This is just the idea of everybody thought miasma was the cause of death, that death is being communicated by this. And I mean, everyone from Charles Dickens on, right? This is how it works. And in that age, right, people, they just start looking like Smurfs with really skinny long toes and hours after your first symptoms arrive, you're dead. You start vomiting and all this diarrhea and die. And so this is a big deal. You know, COVID, there's a high mortality rate among susceptible, vulnerable populations and a low mortality rate among otherwise healthy people. Cholera, I mean, this is just killing everybody, just sort of indiscriminately, just wiping people out, really high mortality rate. And really, really fast. But this was the idea back then of what people were talking about. So in 1844, actual quotation, right? From inhaling the odor of beef, the butcher's wife obtains her obesity. That isn't said in jest. It's not like it's some little joke or some like play or whatever. It's 1844. That's what people actually think is real. So light up that Yankee candle and just start adding the waistline. I mean, that was the belief in the day. And so the stenches, right, the odors of feces are killing people. It is not what you're eating or putting in your mouth. It's not the beef you eat. It's the beef you smell, right? And so that was the assumption. From 1846. And again, you don't need to know these exact quotations or these exact sources. I'm just painting a picture here of what was believed in sort of middle of the 19th century, what people believed in that time. And all smell is, if it be intense, immediate acute disease. And eventually, we may say that by depressing the system and rendering it susceptible to the actions of other causes, all smell is disease. Right? Smell is disease. That was the thought back then. And so the wafting of odors is the most lethal vector, disease sort of vector, viral vector spread of disease that there is. And so that's why everyone was dumping their kind of feces collections into the river. And Jon Snow, the name that you should know, spelled a little bit differently from the Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire character. But he was finding around this pump right here. It's still there. This is a modern picture. This is what used to be Broad Street. It's now Broadwick Street. But there's no handle on that pump today because Jon Snow noticed that cholera was befalling and killing everybody who's getting their water from this thing. I mean, everybody who's coming around this pump and getting their water was dying. And so assumptions of cause and effect, early assumptions of exposure and outcome, again, not quite cause and effect, but this attempt to discover cause and effect, making progress towards cause and effect through exposure and outcome. He noticed that everybody was dying who was drinking out of that, so he suggested the handle be taken off. Now here's when the pump was closed. You don't need to know this level of detail, but the pump was closed here. Pretty much everyone had already died by that point, so he didn't actually save that many lives. It's his literature about this that went on to sort of invent epidemiology and exposure outcome. What Hippocrates was having his philosophical thoughts about, Jon Snow was doing math about. So the foundation of contemporary statistics, really. So 1854, right, shortly after, right in the heat of all of this, on the death of all of this cholera, he publishes his 10th paper, right? And then his 11th paper that same month. And then his 12th paper, this is a really good one. You don't need to know anything specific about any of these papers, but do know about Jon Snow, the most prolific fanatic on this subject. But he's starting to get into some of the math. So you could argue that this was the first epidemiological paper. An argument could be made. His 13th paper was actually a book, but we'll count it as a paper. His 14th, his 15th, right? We're in 1855 at this point. Still in 1855, another one comes out. And although in some of these, the editor starts, in some of these papers, like editors start chiming in, especially like this one. His 17th paper, where editorial comment: we regret that from want of space we have been compelled to abbreviate Dr. Snow's letter. Remember, he was an obstetrician. Dr. Snow's letter. The important points, however, have been retained. His theory, that is chiefly a blah 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 swallowing feces, and they sort of go on to say, we don't really agree. Like the actual journal doesn't really agree, and they're shortening his article to make room for arguments this. This is the medical position at the time, is cholera is a matter of odors, right? It's miasma or miasma as opposed to ingesting. It's not drinking. 18th, 19th papers come out, 20th paper comes out, 21st, another good one, another arguably this sort of first true epidemiological paper. It's hard to really say what the first of something is, the very first ever, because there's sort of a progress where things are kind of crappy and they get better and better and better. And at what threshold do you consider this? Epidemiology, right? 22nd paper comes out, 23rd paper comes out, and he's really going now beyond the West End of London, right? And he's looking at these other areas. 24th paper is a big one. And so this is one of the papers people say, the first ever paper on epidemiology. Who cares? Who cares what the first epidemiological paper was? It was John Snow's. It was one of John Snow's in that series of papers. And what he was looking at is, again, Southwark and Lambeth. You saw those on the map opposite the River Thames from Soho, right, in that area, Westminster, in that area. And but he found that cholera was the mortality, people dying from cholera, was 6 times higher in people who are getting their water from Southwark, which was this polluted region. This is where everyone's dumping their shit into the river, and then Southwark is downstream from that. Lambeth is upstream. Lambeth, while it's not clean, it's not hygienic, it's probably worse than Stockton water. Stockton water is just, nothing to brag about, but Lambeth is we'll call that one Stockton water. It's good enough. Southwark is downstream from everyone's dumping their shit in, and it's 6 times higher mortality rate from people coming from Southwark. This is really compelling when you start doing the math. But I don't know if you're going to be able to hear these, but the civic and government and alternative researcher take, if for anybody who's seen, right, so if you've seen Game of Thrones or read the books, Song of Ice and Fire, that character whose name is slipping my mind, practically her only line is, nothing, Jon Snow, and some of it, I don't know if she's dying or, pre, some coital situation here, but every single scene with her is like, nothing, Jon Snow. And that is the response. That's the government response. That's the research response. That's every doctor's response to what Jon Snow was saying. And everyone's like, no, miasma is how we're getting it. Keep dumping your dumps into the River Thames. And so there's tons of these Parliament papers, and so one from 1854 here, and you look at after careful inquiry, we see no reason to adopt this belief. The choleric infection multiplies rather in air than in water. And so this is these parliamentary papers from 1854, 1855. So this is after Jon Snow is really championing this cause of, we need to use math, we need to use evidence, we need to use what was not yet really epidemiology, but the foundation of epidemiology, those tools, those instruments, that way of answering these questions. And nobody was listening to him. It was just like this solo act, and there's a couple of supporters, but for the most part, everyone was opposed to Jon Snow. And yeah, removing the pump off the handle, all right, he saved a life or two, fine. But it's his research that really mattered. And eventually people did buy into it, but he was dead, right? And they did not resurrect him. He went to his grave thinking the whole world is lost. He knew he was right. He was doing the math, running the numbers. He knew he was right. And he goes to the grave with everyone saying he's wrong. You don't need to know any of these names. This is just if you happen to be curious and you want to go into public health, here's a few other names that are worth looking up at this foundational stage of epidemiology. The only epidemiologist I'm going to ask about on the test, so like coronavirus today. Yeah, so there's a lot of information today. Doesn't have to be on COVID, but on whatever it is, where people sort of refuse to accept scientific dissemination, scientific. Global warming is the most hilarious one. Everyone is known. Every scientist has agreed on this for eternity, and and yet we're still like, it's a hoax, and like this is so crazy. I mean, there's a number of Jon Snows today in a number of politically sensitive fields, and for whatever bias, whether it's financial bias or as soon as somebody states their position, we don't like to go back on stated position. So we state our position and we stick with it. And so anyway, so there's a lot of Jon Snows today, but cholera was sort of the first one of Jon Snow. And what Jon Snow did wonderfully was talk about the population level. Epidemiology in that age was on the population level. It was not on here's a bunch of population statistics and let's talk about the individual, right? It was at the population level. And some of the mistakes we make today is to analyze population-based statistics and then make claims about the individual, because that gets a little bit, and we talked about this with breast cancer, the BRCA genes, like Angelina Jolie, she's an individual. The breast cancer risk is at a population level. And so it gets a little bit wobbly in the gate between those two. It gets a little bit hazy in the connection. So after Jon Snow, epidemiology starts to mostly describe phenomena. Epidemiology becomes this very descriptive phenomenon. And so the who, the what, the where, and the when of health-related events. Again, what falls upon the people? What people is it falling upon, right? The who. What are the characteristics of this? Where is this happening? And what is the time course of some of this stuff? So this is, begins with cross-sectional studies and sort of describes a phenomenon. So with coronavirus, right, we see a ton of cross-sectional studies of what that looks like. And then people are starting to get into some of the regression modeling of predictions of sort of vectors of spread, stuff like that. And then you're getting into the how, the sort of analytical piece of how is this spreading and how is this coming about and arising. But today, you get into the 21st century, and epidemiology is just, I mean, it's like the, I don't know, tuna nets, I mean, they are catching everything, right? There's not just dolphins in there. I mean, it's just the entire ocean is caught in the tuna net. And so we have this very, very wide net. And that's what epidemiology is doing today. And to a degree, it's a disservice. I could argue either side. I could argue that it's good to have these ideas enter the mainstream so that we can test them further, and just let's come up with all of these correlations so we can test them further. The negative part is people run with these ideas and assume they're true. The first finding that comes out, everyone thinks it's true, and it's just some spurious correlation. So again, I can argue both sides, and we will in this class as we keep moving forward say both sides are right, both sides are wrong. There's pros and cons to each. But at the foundation, the problem is there's this fallacy of human imagination, and that we just see cause and effect. Everything we're going to see cause and effect. And so if you remember that Michael Shermer quotation about patternicity or apophenia, about how we're seeing cause and effect in everything, regardless of whether there's a story to tell, we invent a story. So let's say you go to Kokoro in an age when Kokoro is open, and you have sushi and it's like warm and bad and flaccid. And then later that night, you're feeling like your stomach is rumbling, and you become like a 7-year-old, and you're like, oh, hooey, 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 or whatever noises somebody makes when they're 7 and they're like, shitting their pants. And so you immediately make this association, this cause and effect, right? Exposure outcome that in our minds becomes this absolute irrefutable cause and effect of I ate this sushi and now my stomach is a disaster, and like diarrhea is running down my thighs or whatever, cause and effect. But it might not be the case. It could be anything. Like, yeah, you ate sushi and later tonight you're not feeling good. That doesn't mean the sushi is the cause, the culprit, it's been indicted, but you gotta give it a chance, right? So when people look up at the clouds, right, I mean, everyone sees Godzilla. If you know what Godzilla is, we all see, Godzilla in this picture, but it's just moisture. It's just some like mist and water in the air and clouds, or maybe it's smoke and ash today. But we see cause and effect, we see patterns in everything. And epidemiology is this brilliant way of making sense of patterns. Are those patterns real? Well, let's test it. Let's test if those patterns are real. Let's see if it can withstand scrutiny, if it can withstand sort of mathematical modeling. So in the 20th century, the 1900s, right, in the 20th century, we started looking at diseases mostly, but not like cholera, right? We start looking at more standard staple diseases that everybody has, not necessarily epidemics, right? Let's look at some endemics. Let's look at some just stuff that everybody has. Heart disease. Everybody is dying of cardiovascular disease of some sort. Some sort of infarction, whether it's a stroke or a heart attack or skeletal muscle or whatever it is. And so let's look for risk factors. And then once we know what is causing all of this stuff, what are the culprits, the probable culprits, we can start having legislation. So heart disease, cardiovascular disease, that's really the major one of the 20th century. Now cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, all of these we're investigating too. But you get into ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine. If you guys are publishing, this is where you'll be presenting at the ACSM conference, and MSSE is their primary journal. They have several journals. But you look at all these risk factors. Well, where did this come from? How do we know what the risk factors for cardiovascular disease are? Well, it's age and it's family history and cigarette smoking and sedentary lifestyle and obesity and hypertension and dyslipidemia, right? Your lipid panels are off. You have high LDLs and low HDLs and whatever. Pre-diabetes, right? You're not controlling your sugar very well. Your fasted glucose is very high, or you don't respond to sugar when you eat it very well. You don't put it away. And so how do we know all these are risk factors? We don't know that by running randomized controlled trials and saying, okay, we're going to have this group do a bunch of smoking and this group over here, you are smoke free, and we'll follow you forward and see about cardiovascular disease, see who has a heart attack. We don't do that. Zero to get as we're going to slide during first. Let's just prefer just water. So recording. If you have a question about one of the previous slides, that's fine. Yeah, type it or speak up. But I'm just going to keep talking until I hear the question. But so how do we know about these risk factors? Epidemiology. It's John Snow, right? It's 100% epidemiology. We don't mess up people's lipids and then say, oh yeah, we caused a heart attack. We don't do that. Maybe you can mess with it a little bit in rats and stuff, but we notice correlations between high LDLs and higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. We know high blood pressure correlates strongly and positively with higher strokes and heart attacks and cardiovascular adverse events. And so we notice these things and mathematically calculate these correlations and our confidence and how likely and strongly are these things associated. It is just epidemiology. It is not randomized controlled trials. So it's a little bit flimsy. There's no real cause and effect. It's a little bit flimsy. And so this guy down here, right, maybe he's having a heart attack. Hard to know for sure. What caused it? Maybe he's an alcoholic. Maybe he is more obese than his sweater reveals. Maybe his lipids are terrible. How do we know what's causing his heart attack? Or how do we know? Why do we have these government warnings on things, right? Why do we have alcohol have a government warning? Say, according to the Surgeon General, women should not drink alcohol beverages during pregnancy because of the risk of birth defects. How do we know? There's no randomized trial where we take 1,000 pregnant women and say, okay, don't drink any alcohol during pregnancy. But you 1,000 women over here, eat 2 bottles of Thunderbird every day. And let's see what happens to your offspring, right? Let's see what happens to your kids. That study can't be done. Again, people, arguments can be made about let's get it like a mouse to do it or something. But all we're doing is seeing the type of people who drank a bunch of alcohol during pregnancy are more likely. We see higher odds of these populations giving birth to more defective offspring, right? And so associations, this is John Snow statistics over here. And we'll just lump Miley Cyrus into this group, of blaming alcohol for offspring outcomes. It's 100% epidemiology. We don't have any answer but epidemiology. So there's a question: what is the next step when you notice there's a correlation and we cannot run a test due to ethical concerns? Correlation doesn't equal causation. Really good question. So what the next step is, really well-controlled giant epidemiological studies. That's really what I do. Is I'm essentially I do medical and clinical epidemiology for hospitals, because you can't really randomize patients to control groups or randomize patients to bad treatments and stuff, but certain patients don't receive better treatments, and we can control for things and come up with pretty confident outcomes. Epidemiology is way better in terms of its regression modeling. We're going to spend a lot of time on regression than it used to be. And so we'll talk about basic epidemiology. We've introduced this before, right? We have cross-sectional studies, we have case control studies, we have cohort studies, very basic. When you get into sort of modern epidemiology with sort of sophisticated regression modeling, you get to control for a lot of things and be more confident in your answer, isolate answers independent of confounders. But it's not perfect. And so what do? You illegally do research. What's the next step? You sort of ethically can't really answer the question with cause and effect or anything that close to cause and effect. You can get compelling correlations of cause and effect. Randomized controlled trials can come really close. Regression modeling isn't quite as close. In an epidemiological sense. So what do? It's tough, right? Or you look at really old data. Look at data before IRBs were a thing, where people could essentially, there's really compelling data on low carbohydrate diets and glucose regulation. Now people can't do this anymore, but they keto adapted populations before IRBs would approve of this. Now, like, people are at risk of death and no way you could do this study, but a long time ago the study was done. You can look it up. They keto adapted people and then they inject a big dose of insulin, which is going to kill people, right? You're going to go into hypoglycemic shock and you're going to die and at least get super loopy. But the keto adapted people were able to tolerate low levels of blood sugar. There was a tolerance here that if somebody was not keto adapted, they would just die. You can't do that experiment anymore, but it was once done, right? So some of the once done experiments are wonderful, but they're done sort of badly, right? They didn't record everything they should have. They didn't understand how physiology works, and so they should have been documenting more variables or controlling for more stuff. The actual experiments themselves, you can never repeat as long as IRBs are institutional review boards are reviewing and prohibiting unethical data or potentially harmful data. So I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, but you can either look at early data and sort of try to make sense of it, or you can do illegal analyses now, test yourself in your basement or something, or try to make as much sense of it as you can with kind of nice regression modeling. But again, it opens up, how do you know that colas jiggle my midriff and poison my baby teeth? How do you know that sugar? Why is the American Dental Association making claims about sugar? How do they know? You don't just do experiments where you have a bunch of kids just cover their teeth in sugar all night, and then some other kids don't eat any sugar and drink a bunch of water and then see what happens to their teeth in the morning. Oh, you guys have holes in your teeth. You don't do that experiment, but you look at what the diet consists of and make claims. Those claims can get stronger and stronger according to sample size, right? How many people you're enrolling, according to kind of how many variables you can control for, stuff like that. So ecological studies, we've talked about this. We're just going to kind of spend the rest of today looking at these different study types, again, reviewing these study types from what we know now. So these ecological studies are really, this is what John Snow did. we have associations, right? We have compelling associations. There's exposures to something, and there's outcomes. We got the disease or we didn't, right? There's an outcome. And so that's ecological and ecological epidemiology. I mean, ecological studies really are epidemiology, but just looking at disease, just looking at these different sort of disease states and exposures and outcomes. So we've seen this slide before, a branch of biology, and we're looking at exposures and outcomes, relations of one variable to another. And so we know, like, the River Thames, right, the poop water and the cholera, right, the first ecological study that we know of. And so this is a great one. UV radiation and cancer, right? So does the sun, you get a bunch of sunburns and skin cancer. You could say diet and cancer. You could say HPV and cervical cancer. There's lots of variables in cancer. You could say sugar and cancer. You could say protein and cancer. There's associations with both of those. Diet, physical activity, and Alzheimer's, plenty of relationships. You could say HIV to AIDS. There's lots of ecological relationships that you could explore. Smoking and cancer. You could look at asbestos, right, and cancer. There's any number of relationships you can look at. And so these sort of classic epidemiological studies. So the correlational studies, just looking at, do two things move together? Correlation, does this variable correlate with that variable positively or negatively? How strongly? You could say every variable correlates to every other variable. The butterfly effect or whatever. A butterfly flaps its wings. You guys know this cliche. Then in Texas, and a hurricane happens in Alabama or whatever. I don't know. It's like a dumb cliche, but you get the idea of every variable is correlated to every other variable to some minuscule, unimportant, ridiculous degree. Strength of correlation is what matters. And then we get into cross-sectional studies, and this is a lot of there's a COVID, right? It just came out, this COVID study about healthcare workers. This is a cross-sectional study on coronavirus and healthcare workers. So in these hospitals in the Netherlands, what does it look like? What right now, at a snapshot, at a specific moment in time, this exact moment in time, what are we looking at? Percentages of things, percentages of mortality, percentages of people who are exposed, who get infected. This cross-sectional study, one moment in time. That's really the thing you have to memorize. You have to just make sure you remember is at a single point in time. That's a cross-sectional study. So getting into the kind of bulk of epidemiological frameworks of these structures of studies, we know what ecological studies are. Exposures and outcomes, right? Exposures and outcomes. Now, this could be time related, right? It could be map related, geographical exposures and outcomes. There's plenty of data on sunlight. You go back to 1980 and we have all this, do sunlight and vitamin D reduce the likelihood of colon cancer? So exposure to sunlight, that's one thing. But sunlight gets interesting because where are people experiencing sunlight? And well, more by the equator, right? Less sunlight up in Canada than there is in Mexico. Or go to, if you're in Africa, South Africa, not as much sunlight as there is in the Congo and Cameroon and Uganda and all those equatorial countries. And so when you start to look at the map, it gets a little bit more interesting. It's like the paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift is also a little bit cliche. I'm so tired of seeing those two words in opposition for how people are titling their papers. But what latitude are you at? Right, the ladder is the latitude. You're moving away from the equator. So what latitude are you at, and what are the odds of getting cancer based on your latitude? That actually gets interesting. I don't know that it's true, but there's some compelling data based on it. You don't need to know that specific data. This is just illustrating ecological studies and the breadth of questions, right? Where curiosity goes and sort of where curiosity sort of wanders off to and how statisticians follow its wandering. Really interesting one here, the seasonal pre-ovulatory overripeness ovopathy. The phase of egg development is protracted. As you move further away from the equator, that particular phase gets protracted, and does a protracted egg development phase, does that predispose people to congenital anomalies, right? So that's ecological studies. Again, don't like memorize these specific things, because I don't even know if it's true. These are just hypotheses that have some support for them. And so I wouldn't go, at the dinner table saying, well, as you move away from the equator, this is really just to say, what is the breadth of ecological studies? And there's data for this, maybe it's true. But the exposures and outcomes can be anything, right? It can be dietary, it can be geographical, it can be how long, so sort of chronological exposures to things. And so as people look at the map, they're seeing, breast cancer and leukemia, they're seeing brain tumors, they're seeing lung cancer, all of these associations with the map, with longitudes, mostly latitudes. And people will talk about the Mediterranean diet, right? Oh, eat a bunch of olive oil and it has all these protective effects. Maybe it might, it very well could, but also what are the latitudes, what are the geographical conditions where olives grow and where people eat a ton of olives and where people drink all of the juice, right? All of that olive oil that they're kind of dousing on everything. Where is this happening? Because the where, remember the who, the what, the where, all of these questions of epidemiology, the where may matter. I'm not saying it does, may matter just as much as the dietary part of it. Or there could be physical activity things. People are walking to get their meals and then they're walking home after their meals. I mean, all that physical activity, postprandial exercise, it's called, can offset the insulin's requirement to put those calories away, to put the sugar away, especially. So you get this non-insulin dependent glucose uptake. So maybe there's a lot of variables, right? So ecological studies, just use your imagination and statistics can follow. Statistics can really go just about anywhere. Can statistics answer unanswerable questions like, is Oprah an alien? No, that's not a mathematical question. You can't answer that with stats, but use your imagination with exposures and outcomes, and statistics can almost always follow you and provide a compelling answer, if not a sound one. Correlational studies, right? We're getting correlations. That correlation is going to be between -1 and positive and +1, +1. And a correlation of 1 is a perfect correlation. As variable 1 goes up 1 point, variable 2 goes up some specific increment every single, it's just exact y = mx + b stuff. -1 is the inverse of that. It's a perfect correlation in the opposite direction. As variable 1 increases, variable 2 decreases, and they're perfectly aligned. There's no wiggle room, there's no scatter, no variance, they're perfect. So that's +1 and -1. Most correlations, almost every single thing falls between there. Correlation of 0 means total scatter, shotgun blast. A shotgun blast looks organized compared to a correlation of 0. Correlation of 0.3, like, okay, there's something there, right? You're starting to get somewhere. Correlation of 0.6, 0.7, right? 0.8, definitely. You're getting strong, right? You get in that like 0.7 range, you're strong. 0.3, there's something there. 0 to 0.3, like, that's pretty weak. Positive or negative. And so correlation, causation, people talk about this all the time, right? It's becoming a giant cliche, but it's still worth acknowledging. I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class. Now I don't. Sounds like the class helped. Maybe, right? It's cute, but it's not funny, but it's cute. That's, the stats class doesn't, I don't need to explain the joke. But then causality is a much better word than causation. Causation is like, let's make a word that rhymes, or like causality, but correlation doesn't imply causality. It's not catchy. But to understand that correlation could just be spurious. It could just be based on nothing, right? Correlation isn't the whole story. It's a flag. It says, hey, there's something here. Maybe there's something real. And so when you look at like a correlation study, well, somebody, I don't want to keep checking the time. Like, well, somebody just tell me like 10 minutes, 5 minutes. Will somebody be my timer? We're not like already passed. So mortality attributable to low levels of education in the United States. Attributable, that just means it's correlation. The lower your level of education, the higher the onset of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, what this article is looking at. But like lots of stuff tracks with education. The type of people who pursue education usually pursue, they like care about their bodies too. They care about their minds and education and their careers and job placement and sort of longevity of a career. Yeah, they're probably going to take care of their bodies a little bit at the same time. So it's not like I went to school, so my body will last longer. So these correlations aren't really the whole picture. So somebody who isn't educated, okay, maybe they don't know how to read a food label, and so it's not like education explains mortality. It's correlated. It's just correlated. I mean, I would be shocked if the more you read a dictionary, the longer your heart lasts. I don't think that's a correlation. I think the correlation is the type of people who pursue education are the type of people who take care of themselves. And so then getting into these bottom three, we've been talking about them, these observational studies, but just trying to hit on them a little bit more as we go. Cross-sectional studies. Again, you're looking at prevalence of things. Just think COVID, all of these COVID studies. And what used to be like, all right, how many people have heart disease? Let's figure that out. I mean, that's like practically political arithmetic. How many people have a condition? But now we're doing more sophisticated studies. But when there's some epidemic, right? When we have an epidemic, we immediately just thrust into this research world with cross-sectional studies, one after another. I mean, like every day a cross-sectional study comes out. What are the percentages of dentistry COVID patients? Or if I saw that study, only because it came out of our dental school, a cross-sectional study on dentistry and COVID. They're so easy to do. A cross-sectional study is the easiest thing in the world to do. And among the easiest things in the world to publish are novel outcomes. This has never been published before, and so it becomes really easy. Because everybody wants to publish this exciting thing for the first time. And so cross-sectional studies, you can do this in 20 minutes, and then it takes a little longer to write it, but analyzing is like a 20-minute project. And you will very soon be able to analyze this in 24 minutes. But so that's cross-sectional studies, right? Again, at one point in time, what does it look like? So here's a cross-sectional study from 1998. Prevalence of serious eye disease and visual impairment in a North London population. Population-based cross-sectional study. Should be a hyphen there. You don't need a comma. Grammatical errors you'll find are just everywhere in these studies. But that's just an example. You don't need to know this study, just like you don't need to know anything about egg development, right? You don't need to know the specific studies. What you need to know is the concepts of what a cross-sectional study is and what it can explore. And so they're looking at like people 65 years and older with untreated visual impairment. What does this population look like at one point in time? Cross-sectional study. So you could do your own cross-sectional study for this class, right? What percentage of students exercise at Bond? What percentage of students have scholarships of some sort, athletic or academic or whatever else we have scholarships for? What percentage of students use tutoring services? You could do that, right? Or you could get more advanced, right? You could get into some of these sort of advanced ecological regression types of analyses where you're looking at exposures and outcomes. What predicts the use of tutoring? What student characteristics predict the use of tutoring? Is it GPA? Is it the age of the student? Is it, the sex, gender of the student? Language, does that matter? Stockton students versus international or kind of at least outside of Stockton or outside of the state students, different majors. You could look at predictors, something like that. And then you get into some regression analyses there. Um, Cohort studies, almost always prospective. If there's a question on the test about a prospective epidemiological study, that's a cohort. Now, it's possible to do a retrospective study, but only after you've done a prospective cohort study and you just use the same database to look backwards, right? So cohort studies, just think of these as prospective. Is it possible to have a retrospective cohort study? The answer is yes. But who cares? These ones are prospective. So cohort studies, prospective. You get a bunch of people, a population, a sample or a population, and remember the population is everybody. A sample is a group of people from that everybody. A sample from the population, and so in a cohort study, you take a group of people who do not have the illness or the outcome you're considering. They haven't graduated yet, maybe. And so you're going to look at what predictors of graduation, or they don't have COVID, and you're going to look at predictors of COVID based on different exposures, based on different circumstances, different conditions. That's a cohort study. You follow these people forward. So step one, identify your population that doesn't have a disease or whatever outcome. Step two, identify two different samples within that population, right? Half of them have an exposure, half of them don't. Half of them smoke, half of them don't, right? And you're going to see who gets lung cancer or something. Step three, follow them. Just track them forward and then see if there's a difference in the prevalence, in the occurrence of that outcome. You calculate what's called a relative risk, no relative risk, right? So if you're doing a cohort study, it's relative risk, write that down. Step five, report your findings, but just don't be like, this caused that, right? Just be cautious. Include some caveats, right? Include your limitations, and don't speak too boldly in a cohort study. Here's an example of a cohort study, mortality and smoking. That's so obvious, and there's tons of these things. This is the most obvious one. You follow smokers forward and see what happens. Another prospective cohort study, adverse socioeconomic conditions in childhood and cause specific adult mortality. Prospective observational study, sort of a terrible title. But they're looking at all these like Scotland children, all these like children of Scottish parents, and manual labor. If the parents are manual laborers, which kids follow those kids forward, who's more likely to have a heart attack? Who cares? I don't know, it's probably not really entirely true, but there's statistical support for it. Again, retrospective cohort study, possible, but stupid. Don't even think, it's not stupid, but don't even really remember that this is a thing, because you have to do this prospective cohort study and then you use the same database to look retrospectively. It's possible. Understand that it's possible. Acknowledge this is a possibility, but think of cohort studies. Associate cohort studies with prospective. So a study that you could do is the dependent variable, your outcome. Admission to graduate school, right? You graduate, now are you going to get into PT school? Yes or no? Odds ratio, right? Yes or no? How likely is it? The population, peers at Pacific, right? Everybody who's a health and exercise science, well, not everybody in health and exercise science is going to PT, but everybody in the pre-PT club, all right, that's your population. And then the exposures, right? Whether students have athletic scholarships or whether students, what the GPA is, whatever it is of some sort of category, above 3 versus below 3 GPA, or some sort of categories. And does that predict admission? You want to control for other confounding variables if you can. Case control studies, right? These are always retrospective. Case control, there is no prospective. Case control is retrospective. So think of cohort as prospective, case control as retrospective. And people already have the illness or not illness. People already have the outcome or not outcome, right? There's two different conditions, and you're looking at exposures that could have, looking backwardly at exposures that could have associated with those conditions. So people have heart attacks, they have myocardial infarction, right? A heart attack. People have these heart attacks, and then let's look backward and see how many of these people smoked and how many they didn't, and we'll figure out these odds of what the potential, the association, the correlation, the effect of smoking is on that outcome. So you look backward. So a case control study you could do is, once people graduate, you could say graduation. We have a bunch of people who managed to graduate and a bunch of people who didn't at high school or college or grad school or whatever. We have a ton of people who went to school. Some of them graduated, some of them didn't. Let's look backward on their experience. Let's look backward on their experience and figure out what variables predicted graduation, right? Whether they live on campus, do students who live on campus do better or worse, right? Well, that commute time is terrible, so I didn't make it to class, or my dorm is just like the pits, right? I mean, it is just a moldy dump in there and I can't, or it's like loud, or it's whatever. There's gunshots in Stockton, whatever it is. You know, what are the conditions that are going to predict graduation, and then control for some confounding variables. So we all have an idea, right? Cohort versus case control, right? A cohort study is follow forward. Again, it's possible to follow backward and just acknowledge the possibility of retrospective, but it's not really what a cohort study is for. Cohort study, the purpose of this is to follow people forward, right? I grab a population who doesn't have an illness and they're susceptible to it, or some sort of outcome, and they're susceptible to it. But they have different exposures. They live in different states. One of the groups of people lives on the equator. The other group lives in Antarctica or something, and then follow them forward and track the outcome. Case control, people either have a condition or they don't have it. They have cancer or they don't have cancer. They have heart disease or they don't have heart disease. They graduated or they didn't graduate. They won or they lost, whatever. This has already happened. And we're looking backward at different exposures that might explain it. So it's a nice article. This is just talking about these, the premise of these types of studies, what a case control is, what it's attempting to do in theory, what it's attempting to do, how you calculate this stuff. Write this down, sort of. You don't need to know it exactly. I'm not going to make you calculate this. Now, if you want to calculate it, for your study, if you want to do it, this is a case control study. If you want to do a case control study for your project, write this down in some additional detail. Otherwise, just be able to, multiple choice format, be able to sort of identify this stuff. So you have cases and you have controls. Cohort study, cases and controls. You have some people were exposed and some people weren't exposed. Right, so you make this little case, or this table, and then you get an odds ratio, and it's just, that's the math right there, right? So the ratio of odds in the exposure cases, which is A divided by C, to the odds of exposure in the controls, so B divided by D, right? So it's just this compared to that, and so that's your odds ratio. So case control odds ratio. Write that down. Case control odds ratio. And what that ratio means is, like, if the odds ratio is less than 1, the exposure has a protective effect. If you're like smoking and the odds ratio is less than 1, smoking is protecting you from lung diseases and heart diseases and stuff. But in general, smoking is going to associate with an odds ratio of greater than 1, increased odds of that exposure eliciting that outcome. If the odds ratio is 1, that just means, like, anything times 1 is 1, is itself, right? If 1 times 1 is 1, 5 times 1 is 5, and so you're not changing the odds. If the odds ratio is 1, there's no difference. That exposure is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. According to this particular study and this particular analysis and this particular sample at this particular point in time, it's irrelevant. I'm not saying, and whenever you encounter an odds ratio of 1, that doesn't mean these variables will never correlate. It just means in this particular scenario, this isn't a variable that's statistically of any value. Now, if the odds ratio is greater than 1, the exposure associates with an elevated incidence of the outcome. If the odds ratio is lower than 1, the exposure associates with a protective effect or a reduction in the odds of that outcome. Is, again, just a look at how these things are calculated. I am not going to make you calculate an odds ratio on a test. You just have to know case control study, odds ratio, what an odds ratio of 1.5 implies, what an odds ratio of 20 implies, what an odds ratio of 1 implies, what an odds ratio of 0.2 implies. You don't need to calculate them, just understand that much of it, and that's it. A cohort study, right? Moving into cohort studies. And so everybody is disease-free, illness-free, condition-free at the onset of the study, and we're doing a prospective study following them forward based on exposures, right? Exposed and unexposed, but nobody has the case. So at the end of the study, some people have the case and some people don't. Well, was it the exposed people or the non-exposed people? So you just make this 2x2 table, just like with the other one. But here, what you're doing is a relative risk, right? So a cohort study, relative risk. Case control, odds ratio. Cohort, relative risk. Case control, odds ratio. Cohort, relative risk. That repetition should encourage you to write it down and try to log it in your memory in some permanent space. But the probability of the disease in the exposed group divided by the probability of disease in the unexposed group. That's your relative risk. The most famous study to do this is the Nurses' Health Study, which we'll talk about at length in the coming week or so, before our I don't know, soon. We'll talk about that soon. But this is hundreds of thousands of nurses, men and women both, and they're just following these people forward year after year after year after year after decade, and following them forward and sort of tracking everything about them. I mean, it's brilliant, but it's also so many spurious findings. It's sort of a mess. And it sort of divides, 10 minutes left, thanks. It sort of divides what I was talking about earlier, that I can argue pro and con of publishing spurious correlations that are just sort of random, arbitrary correlations, the value of that, and the harm in doing so. I could argue both of those. And the Nurses' Health Study, people really rag on this because it just publishes so many high impact papers, massive papers. I mean, the guy who leads this is regarded as the highest, sort of the most impact points. There's a lot of algorithms that kind of quantify a researcher's impact, and Walter, whatever his name is, not Walter White, but Walter, whatever his name is, who did the these studies. He's the main guy. Is sort of regarded as like the highest impact researcher. It's not like he has the most grant money or anything, but anyway, I don't remember his name because I don't even remember it. Walter Whitty. That's not, whatever. That just sounds like Walter White. At some point, well, we'll look him up, and you can just look him up on like ResearchGate or something. Massive score. But he's the Nurses' Health Study, and they just publish all these correlational studies, and there's cons to doing that, right? You're misleading people. You publish these correlations, and they don't really matter. It's just random chance that you found this stuff. But they'll also find important things at the same time. And so we wind up with all of this advice from these, from cohort and case control studies, but those cohort studies, that Nurses' Health Study, really we find a ton of advice about fish oils are good, trans fats are bad, sedentary lifestyles are bad, and stuff about fruits and vegetables and whatever, whether it's yoga or overhead, like, fluorescent lighting, all of these things, we get all of this information about. And that information may or may not be sound. It needs a little bit more scrutiny before we accept it. Just like that latitude information. If we're going to look at, Scottish children of manual laborers, right? Or if we're going to look at, pregnancy in equatorial regions versus frozen region. If we're going to start talking about these things, we need a little bit more scrutiny, a little bit more repetition of the data. We can't just take the first blush of findings, because that could just be random chance. But random chance is fine to publish a little bit too. Don't be too hard on anything. I'm going to be sort of hard on it in this semester, but this is my caveat, that there's no reason to really rag on it that much, although everybody does. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. If you have questions, I know there was a question earlier that, is it okay to go back slides and ask about questions? If that question is still lingering, let me know, or if anything else has come up. What, is somebody at the beach, or is that just a background? Oh, maybe that's like an optional background I get to use. I do not want background. So if you have questions, let me know. If you don't have questions, feel free to leave to get out of here and go enjoy your Wednesday? Go have an asthma attack. Nothing? Okay. Everyone get out of here. I hope that made some sense. Just remember sort of the bold points about it. The Jon Snow stuff, not every detail of it, but sort of the primary. You don't need to remember his exact publications or anything, but remembering him is the foundational stuff. And a lot of the structural framework of research, cross-sectional studies, correlation, I mean, all that stuff. That's it. Okay, I'll see everybody in some couple of days, some hours. Bye.